Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of Beastly Talks. I'm your host, Ian Helling, and I am a week off at the moment. There has been a lot going on, and I have been sick in the meantime. I'm actually still a bit sick, but I've popped a couple of cold and flus. I've had a whiskey or two, and I've got some toilet paper next to me in case my nose gets too stuffy. I have Ollie and Agner as moral support, and hopefully we'll be able to power through this whole thing. But yeah, it's been a lot going on since I got back from Norway. Rex, the assistance dog, is still here. We're having a lot of fun with him. I'm going to be talking about him a little bit. And then we had Ben's reactivity workshop last weekend. And that was amazing. The workshop was so cool, and I had nothing but good feedback on it. It was really great people, a lot of really good questions and intricate discussions. And Ben actually went over time because of all the detailed questions. And he did kind of point that out, like, hey, I'm running out of time here, but you guys have so many good questions, and I feel like I need to dive into it properly to get you guys to give you guys the information that you are actually asking for in a really detailed manner. Ben had a really interesting and detailed way of doing diagnostics on new dogs that he met, and how he would interview the owner of the dog before he actually met the dog. And he would break everything down into tiny, tiny little details. And that really helped kind of set up the scenario that we were facing. We then brought the dog out. We kind of saw the dog's reaction to different things, and we went back to the diagnostics table to see whether things needed to be changed or whether they were pretty accurate. And yeah, it just gave a really good indication of what to work on, where to start, what to stay away from, what tools to introduce, all this kind of stuff. So that is definitely something I'll be studying further and introducing into my training. But yeah, overall, amazing workshop, and people had a really good time, and so did I. So thanks again, Ben, for making the trip over to cold Melbourne. Now, obviously, when you're dealing with reactive and aggressive dogs, one of the things that is just unavoidable to talk about is the use of pressure, and the use of corrections, and the use of negative reinforcement, especially in the training of these dogs. And, you know, it was funny because Ben actually refers to the force-free people as the flat earthers of dog training, which I thought was amazing because they pretend to have science on their side while they're quoting 70-year-old science that has been proven to be wrong multiple times ever since. And they cry about, oh, you shouldn't use punishment. Oh, shouldn't use pressure. Oh, the dogs are so sad, blah, blah, blah. Because they don't actually understand how proper dog training works. But understanding how to teach with pressure is going to elevate you as a trainer. I think I've talked about this before, but I kind of wanted to go through it again. I want to get a little bit more in depth with it, and I want to give some more clear examples, and especially a good example with Rex, the assistance dog that I've got with me at the moment, and some of the issues that we're facing with him, which has kind of limited me in the amount of positive reinforcement based teaching that I can do with him. So hopefully this will be interesting for everyone. And again, the use of pressure, the use of negative reinforcement, if you're going to elevate your training skills, that is something you have to wrap your head around. It's just that simple. So just to reiterate some basic training terminology. So we break it down into three different stages when we're teaching a dog something new. So it's what we call the teaching phase, which is where the dog doesn't actually know what we're asking them to do. So we're teaching them something brand new. Then we move into the training phase. This is where we start making criteria hires. We ask the dog to do a behavior for longer with more distractions around. And we add a little bit more kind of social pressure on them in order for them to really solidify the behavior and understand that this needs to be done under all circumstances. And then finally, we get into the proofing stage, which is where we take away all tools and we actually start testing the dog in many different scenarios to see how well our training is holding up. Now, what you'll hear a lot of people say, and which is what I do, most of the time as well, is that in the teaching phase, we teach everything with positive reinforcement. So we bring out some toys, we bring out some food, whatever it is that we're going to use to motivate the dog, and we try to teach them the particular skill that we're after in the early stages using positive reinforcement. And again, this is always my go to whenever it is possible. However, um, as I've talked about before, positive reinforcement has a very clear ceiling. So whether you are struggling to create prolonged duration into that behavior with positive reinforcement only, and in some cases, whether you have trouble teaching the dog to actually do something, because when you're putting a piece of food to the dog's nose and you're just luring them around the room, it actually takes a lot longer for the dog to learn what you want from them than if you teach with pressure and negative reinforcement. Now, whenever I've had students in the past, I always bang on about the what we call the unforced forced fetch. And I teach this to all of my students because I think it's a really incredibly valuable learning tool in order to understand that, yes, you can actually teach a dog to do things with negative reinforcement without the use of food or luring and blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of what I want to get into a little bit now. So, what does teaching with pressure actually mean? Well, it means that in most cases, we apply some low level pressure to the dog in order to motivate them to find out or to, I guess, solve the puzzle of what we're asking them to do so that they can turn the pressure off. So, negative reinforcement training, as I've mentioned before, is what we also refer to as escape and avoidance training. So the dog experiences as a mild level of pressure, whether that's physical pressure, whether it's social, spatial, doesn't really matter, whatever you're using to train the dog. But the dog feels a little bit of discomfort. They shift their behaviors around, they cycle through behaviors in order to see what turns the pressure off. And that is basically training teaching with pressure. And so, one example, and probably the most classic example, is teaching a dog to sit, right? So, you can do that with positive reinforcement where you hold food in front of the dog's nose, you lift your hand over the dog's head, the dog's bum then naturally hits the ground. We say the word sit and we give him the treat, right? Now, that requires a lot of repetitions for the dog to actually really understand what we're asking of them and to make the behavior reliable. Now, the way that we would do this with negative reinforcement or pressure is we would pull directly up on the lead. Now, what that's going to do, and I usually just use a regular flat collar for this, unless I have a big, strong dog, then I might use something like a slip lead. But what happens is the dog feels directional pressure up towards the sky. Now, there's not really anywhere for the dog to go at this point because the dog cannot fly. Now, some dogs, if you have a very high drive, twitchy dog, they might try to jump, right? So, for those dogs, it's not always the best place to begin. But for more kind of stable dogs where you need really reliable behavior training put into them, this can be a good place to start. So we pull up on the lead, the dog feels upwards pressure and it goes, "Oh, there's tension around my neck. That's kind of annoying. How how do I make that tension stop?" And so now they might wriggle their head from side to side a little bit. They start cycling through behaviors to try and work out, like, how do I stop this from happening? Now, The natural progression from upwards pressure on the collar is for the dog's bum to go down towards the ground, because upwards pressure on the neck naturally moves the bum down towards the ground. When the bum hits the ground, that's when we say yes, and we take away all the tension on the leash. Now, when we take away tension on that leash, what happens is the dog is actually reinforced for the behavior that he conducted. And so he learns, aha, when I feel tension upwards on the leash, that means I put my bum on the ground, the tension goes away, boom, I solve the puzzle. That's a very simple, straightforward example of how we can use pressure and negative reinforcement to teach a dog something new. Now, another slightly more complicated version of how to teach with pressure can be, for example, how we place train the dog. So you can place train a dog, and place, for those who may not know, is basically sending the dog away to some kind of platform or bed or mat and teaching them to stay there. That's basically what we refer to as place. Now, the common way that most people do this is they grab a treat, they lure the dog over. When all four paws come up on the platform, they say the command, they give the dog the treat, and then they let the dog jump off. Now, that is a way of doing it, absolutely, and it's how I do it most of the time. However, if I'm in a time crunch and I need this to happen pretty quickly, it's actually better for me, or I should say better for the dog, to work out how they do this by themselves by me applying a little bit of pressure. And so, how would that work in this instance? Well, you can use an electric collar to teach a dog to place train. And the way now that a lot of people are probably going to freak out. Oh my God, use an electric collar. Blah. But yes, you can absolutely do that. And so the way that we use electric collars, especially in the training phase, sorry, in the teaching phase, my head's still a bit stuffy from everything. So please bear with me. I'm talking about teaching here, so the dog doesn't know what we want them to do, and we're trying to teach them something new. But in the teaching phase, of a place command, for example, we can put an electric collar on the dog. We can use that e-collar at a very low level. So just a kind of nagging motivational level where we're effectively tapping the dog on the shoulder, going like, hey, I need you to do something. I need you to do something. Now, when the dog feels that, they're not freaking out because it's not painful or anything. They're just like, that's kind of annoying. I wish that would stop. I wonder what I need to do to make it stop. And so now the dog's brain begins puzzling together, how can I make this stop? Which behavior will turn off the pressure? And now you can actually play a game of hot and cold with the dog. So if I'm in an empty room, I have a place board and I have an electric collar on the dog. Every time the dog looks away or moves away from the place board, I can activate the electric collar. The dog now feels the stimulation and goes like, oh, that is telling me I need to do something else in order to turn that pressure off. And so the dog might look around the room, they might cycle around. The second they're facing the place board, you turn the electric collar off. Now, many dogs at that point will become curious because they're like, oh, what is that thing in the middle of the room? And why is there no electric collar when I'm looking at it? Right? Then they might start sniffing and they veer off track again. The e-collar activates, and very quickly the dog goes like, oh, wait a minute, that thing's back on. What do I do now? They look back to the bed or to the place and they take a step towards it, and the e-collar turns off. So now we're effectively playing a game of hot and cold, but we are doing it with an electric collar. What happens is eventually the dog will find his way up on the place board, and then we turn all the electrics off. We say yes, which indicates to the dog they've done the right thing, and we can reward them with food or play with them. So now all we've done is we've switched around positive reinforcement with negative reinforcement. So instead of using positive reinforcement to help the dog out too much in the beginning, we let the dog help itself out. When the dog works it out, what happens is all the pressure comes off. That is the negative reinforcement side of the training because the pressure is gone. Then we follow up with food or play, which is the positive reinforcement side of things. Now the dog is effectively training itself. And when the dog trains itself, guess what? the behavior becomes more solidified in the dog's brain because they worked out the puzzle all by themselves. Incredibly effective method for teaching a dog something because the dog is training itself. So, quickly, what are some pros and what are some cons? Uh, well, the pros for this is the dog actually learns it better and it learns it quicker. And what I mean by that is that they might not pick up on it faster, what they're actually meant to do, but they need less repetition to become um, solid in the behavior and to understand the behavior clearly. And the behavior becomes much less prone to extinction because we're not relying on positive reinforcement to keep the dog helping themselves up on the placeboard. Now, the con is that in the very early stages, it tends to take a bit longer. Of course, because we're not just showing the dog what to do, we're kind of just nudging them into finding out for themselves what to do. So the initial learning phase might take a little bit longer. And it does cause some mild stress early on. So, but again, there's nothing wrong with stress. Stress is something to be withstood, not to crumble to. Right? I talk about this all the time. The more stress resilient your dog is, the more resilient to the world and aversive experiences in general they are going to be. Therefore, they're going to be stronger, less likely to have anxiety, more likely to succeed at whatever it is that they're trying to do. So, that is kind of the very short pros and cons for this methodology. Now, teaching with free shaping, for example, that is basically, just playing the hot and cold game with the dog as well, but without any form of pressure. Or at least that's what a lot of people would have you think. Now, when you are free shaping or training with what we call successive approximation, basically meaning every little step towards the right goal, we reward the dog with usually food because we don't want them to get too excited. So we don't want to teach with toys and balls in the early stages. But that actually has a big element of negative reinforcement to it, especially if the dog has some kind of drive to want to find this out. So the dog goes, "Hey, I want to get that food from you. What do I got to do?" The dog looks at an object on the ground, for example, we click, we reward. Now the dog goes like, "Oh, wait, what's happening?" And they take another look at the thing, we click, we reward. They get a little bit closer, right? And maybe we want the dog to interact with the object, but they interact with it incorrectly in the beginning. So we don't click in reward. What happens now? Well, the dog gets stressed because he's like, "Holy shit, I thought I was on the right path, but now I'm not getting rewarded. What is happening?" Right? So people who say that free shaping is completely free of any force, it's not. It's just mental stress for the dog because they are trying to work out the puzzle and they are trying to work it out without any direct guidance from us, which is the same as when we teach with pressure. The main difference between the two is that we're not applying physical pressure to the dog in order to motivate them, but we are applying social pressure and we are applying spatial pressure in some cases when we do free shaping training. So, yes, while there is no direct physical pressure, which is the thing that the force free people cry about all the time, there is absolutely pressure happening in that form of training as well. Oh, I can feel my energy and my voice already starting to falter a little bit. So let's crack on and get stuck into this. So, I did mention at the beginning the unforced forced fetch. Now, that is a modern take on an old training technique, which was just called the forced fetch. So, let me start by giving you a little bit of history on what the forced fetch is. Then I can talk about what it has evolved into. And then I want to talk a little bit about Rex and how we've had to change up his training for this particular thing. So, the forced fetch was originally a training methodology for hunting dogs. So if you were going to teach a dog to retrieve, say, a duck that had been shot or something like that, you needed to have a rock solid hold command, and the dog had to always bring the thing all the way back to you. Now, like I said, the early force fetch, that was quite brutal. So very often they would use something called a toe hitch, which was basically a string that went around one of the dog's toes into a pulley system. And every time you pulled on that pulley system, it would pull the dog's toe out to the side, causing a pretty significant amount of pain. Now, you would do that before forcing an object into the dog's mouth, and the second the dog had the object in his mouth, you'd let go of the string that was pulling on their toe, right? Thereby taking away the pain. And so this is just crude early negative reinforcement based training that was very often used to make up for poor genetics a little bit. So if you had a dog that didn't have a natural inclination to be a good retriever, they would try and use force on them to make them. Now, another methodology that they used was an ear pinch. So they would stick their thumb inside the dog's ear. They would grab the ear, they would twist it, again causing pain. The dog would open its mouth. You'd put the object in the dog's mouth, then let go of their ear. Right? Pretty crude, pretty harsh, mostly used on really high drive, powerful, like Labrador Retriever hunting dogs and that kind of stuff. Not hunting dogs, retriever dogs, sorry, but like really high drive, kind of bred for hard work type dogs, because they could put up with this. Was it pleasant? Of course not. But could they put up with it? Did they? Well, I guess I should turn around and say, were they crushed by it? No, they were not. And it was effective, but we've come a little bit further now. So now we have started teaching what we call the unforced forced fetch. So the idea is the same, the method is very different. So just to give a shout out here, I learned this from Pat Stewart, who is one of the hosts of the Canine Paradigm, which I believe learned it from Bart Bellin. I don't know where Bart learned it from, but yeah, I just want to give some shout outs to the people that I actually learned this from. But in the unforced forced fetch approach, what we do is we start the training with positive reinforcement. So I would hold an object in front of a dog every time, and I would use successive approximation or free shaping, as I talked about earlier, to teach the dog to grab the object. So what does that look like? Well, I'm holding the object, and if my dog looks at it, I click and I reward with food. The dog sniffs it, I click and I reward with food. The dog shows any interest at all, like licks it, whatever it may be, I click and reward. So small increments towards the final goal, which is the dog grabbing and holding the object that I've got in front of them. Now the dog puts teeth on it, I click and reward. The dog starts putting teeth on it and holding it for half a second, I click and I reward. Now it becomes a game of building up the duration. So every time the dog holds it for a little bit longer, I click and reward to increase the duration of the hold. Now, this is where we see positive reinforcement has a very clear ceiling and it falls apart on its own. Like, not as a teaching mechanism, it's great for that, but it falls apart on its own. So with Agnad, my Malinois, when I taught him this is exactly what I did. Click, reward, until he got better and better at holding. We got to 5, we got to 6. I think we got to nearly 10 seconds. And that's where the positive reinforcement fell apart. So here's the thing. If I've taught my dog, hey, I like it when you hold this object in your mouth, and I begin the process of teaching duration, there will come a point in time where the dog thinks he's doing the wrong thing because there's too long in between reinforcers. Right? So my dog holds it for 2 seconds. I click, I reward. He manages to get to 2.5 seconds. I click, I reward. 3 seconds, blah, blah, blah. We build and we build and we build. He gets to 10 seconds. And now what happens is he thinks to himself, holy shit, I've held this for a long time. Why is my reinforcement not coming? Am I doing something wrong? And he is going to open his mouth. He's going to spit out the object that I'm trying to teach him to hold. Now, at this point, as always, if you're doing positive only training, you failed the session at this point. There's no going back because if you ask the dog to hold the thing again now, he's likely going to spit it out quicker because he thought that was the right thing to do. So if you want to teach this properly, this is the point in time where you have to introduce some negative reinforcement to show the dog, hey, actually spitting it out is wrong as well. Now we implement some negative reinforcement. Now, the way that I do this is usually with the slip lead. So basically, the process is we build up with positive reinforcement. The dog holds it for longer and longer and longer, asks for more and more duration. I click in our reward. I try to always be as close to the previous repetition as possible. That way, I'm going to get as far as possible with positive reinforcement. But what happens now is there comes a point in time, like I said, where the dog gets confused because he's thinking to himself, it's been too long between reinforcements now. He spits out the toy. At that point, what I do is I say no, which is a clear signal to the dog. Hey, you made a mistake. Some pressure is going to be applied. The second I say no, I tighten the slip around the dog's neck. Again, not hard, not at all, because we're still in the teaching phase. I'm not trying to choke the dog off of him biting another dog, right? So we're not using that level of pressure. But I tighten the slip a little bit. My dog then feels the pressure and he tenses up because he goes, oh, now I need to work out the puzzle for how to turn this off. Now, at this point, he has a hold command, right? So he's learned the word hold means put this thing in your mouth and hold it there. So now I tighten the slip. I grab the object on the ground. I lift it up in front of his face. I say hold. He grabs it with his mouth again, and I release tension on the slip. So now I've trained him with positive reinforcement. I like it when you hold this thing, but I've also told him, hey, when you think you've held it for too long, you haven't actually held it long enough because spitting it out is the wrong thing to do. And I'm going to recommand you to hold it. In one training, so it took us about 2 weeks. Sorry, if you hear him panting in the background, it's because it's being needy. Alex, go away on your bed. Moral support isn't always moral support when you're trying to focus, but here we are. Now, I spent about, I think, 10 days to 2 weeks teaching him to hold using just a clicker and positive reinforcement. And we got to about 10 seconds. Now, the first time I introduced pressure to him, when he spat that thing out, I tightened the slip. I said no, I tightened the slip. I recommanded him and I released the tension on the slip. What happened is in one training session, we went from 10 seconds to 30 seconds because he realized not only was it a good thing holding the thing in his mouth, it was also a bad thing spitting it out. And boom, we have clarity. We have a dog that's learning at an incrementally fast rate now. And you can push the dog so much further. And does it freak him out? No, of course not. Sure, if I strangled the shit out of him, he would freak out and he wouldn't want to do it again, right? But that's not what this is about. This is about implementing a little bit of gentle pressure to go, hey, you have to continue holding this. And the dog gets like, oh, I was right in holding it because now I have been told I was wrong in spitting it out. It's as simple as that. Now, from here on, what happens is I can begin to generalize the behavior. So up until this point, I've taught him only with one specific object. I normally use a plastic dumbbell to hold a particular thing. Now I can begin shifting that out. So now I can start grabbing different objects. I can utilize a little bit of pressure before giving the hold command, and I put it in his mouth, release tension on the slip. Boom. He now generalizes very quickly. Oh, whatever he holds in front of me, when he says the word hold, I have to grab it and I have to hold it for as long as, up until he says I can release it, out it, or give, which means put it back into my hand. So this is kind of how we go through the whole unforced force fetch process. Now you'd implement other things during this process as well. Like I would start walking backwards and encourage him to follow me so that he learns to carry it in his mouth while moving. I'd ask him to sit while holding it, right? So he also understands that even if he's doing other things, he's got to multitask and he's got to hold this thing in his mouth. But again, that's the starting point. Teach with positive reinforcement, then move to negative reinforcement to say, hey, you made a mistake spitting it out. Now we start making things more and more complicated in more and more different settings, and we generalize the behavior. Then we take off all the tools and we proof it. So, what about Rex? So, Rex, if you haven't listened to the last episode, which someone told me I was a bit off on, and I wasn't as clear as I normally am, and I apologize for that. I was very tired. I was still a bit jet lagged. And interestingly enough, I was still dreaming in Norwegian when I recorded that episode. Now, a lot of people find that weird. But basically what happens when I go back home to Norway, there's usually three to 5 day um like kind of shifting process in my head. So I get to Norway, I still dream in English for 3 to 5 days. Then, as I repeatedly speak Norwegian, hear Norwegian, what happens is my brain shifts and I begin dreaming in Norwegian. Then I dream in Norwegian for the whole time that I'm there. Even if this time my missus came over and I still spoke a lot of English, I'm still dreaming in Norwegian. Then I come back to Australia. And again, the 3 to 5 day process begins of shifting into dreaming in English. In that, during that shifting process, I say some weird shit because I'm directly translating words. I'm not speaking like as normally as I would. And so that's why I was a bit off in that episode because I was super tired. I had this puppy. Me and him were still trying to work each other out. I was still dreaming in Norwegian. And yeah, so if anyone else thought I was off, that's why. All right, little ramble there, but back to dog training. So what happened with Rex? So Rex is an 8-month-old border collie who is in training to become an assistance dog. And one of the tasks, the trained task that he needs to have is he needs to retrieve things for his owner because if she drops something on the ground, she can't pick it up. He needs to be able to retrieve it. Now, the problem that we ran into with Rex, and he's been like this since a puppy, is that he will very quickly spit things out. It's almost like a reflexive response where he grabs something and he wants to spit it out as quickly as possible. Now, I have seen dogs that have been poorly trained in a forced fetch who almost have an extreme opposition to holding things in their mouths. But with him, I know for a fact that that's not the case. They've tried to do the positive reinforcement thing, holding things out. He grabs them, they click reward. And maybe they've gotten stuck there for too long. So they've kept rewarding him for just grabbing it and spitting it out immediately. That can happen because this does require a fair bit of timing. But uh, I spent 2 weeks here clicking and rewarding, trying to get him to grab it in his mouth and hold it using just treats and positive reinforcement. I made zero progress because, again, like I said, it's almost like a reflexive response, which makes me think in his case, it's probably more of a genetic thing than anything else. Now, I do know he often has bones and things to chew on, and that can ruin a dog's grip. If they're too used to chewing, they can't hold their mouth still, and they almost actively learn not to hold things in their mouth. So just keep that in mind. If you need to teach a dog to hold something, if it is for trials or competitions or whatever, limit a little bit of the chomping as much as you can. Of course, it's okay to give them a bone to chew on from now and then, but that shouldn't be the primary way that you're keeping them entertained because it can backfire on you. So, what do we do with Rex? Well, we did the opposite way. We did what is called the hold conditioning. So, the hold conditioning is basically teaching the entire thing with pressure. And what I mean by that is we open his mouth We put an object into his mouth. We hold our hand under his jaw. We gently raise his head up. So it's kind of pointing up towards the sky at like a 45-degree angle. I'll explain why in a second. And we hold the bottom and the top of his jaw and we wait for him to relax. Then we take our hands away. We take the object out of his mouth. So with him, I began the whole conditioning like that. Straight up negative reinforcement. I pry open his mouth, like not harshly, like I'm not using a fucking crowbar here. Like, don't get me wrong, I just put a finger in the side of his mouth. He then naturally opens his mouth because he doesn't want to bite me, and then I put an object in his mouth. Right? It sounds really harsh, but I am filming all of this and I'm hoping to make a video of how all of this comes together. But we spent about a week doing that. And because that training is stressful, I only did one session a day. So we did one like 3, 4, 5 minute session a day where I open his mouth, I teach him to hold, I hold his mouth closed, I wait for him to relax, I say yes, I take it out. Now it's probably also worth mentioning at this point, where if you're training with pressure, what you can do is you can give the command right from the beginning, right before you give the dog the task to do. Because if you're using pressure, you know you can follow through and you can have a successful repetition every time. Therefore, you can name the behavior right off the bat. This also helps the dog learn quicker because the hold command then becomes a conditioned response to like, oh, here comes the hand. If I hold it by myself, guess what? Maybe the hands won't come. Right. And when I say hands, I mean literally like my open palm under his jaw and my other open palm on top of his nose. Right. When I say the hands are coming, it sounds like I'm going to beat the shit out of him. That is not at all what I do. But now I hold under his jaw, I hold on top of his nose. We start building duration. So I hold for a second. We're doing the exact same thing. I'm just not doing it with food. I'm doing it with my hands. That's the only difference. And after a second, I say yes. I take the object out of his mouth. And while he's holding the object quietly, I'm gently patting him on the nose because he was very chompy in the beginning. And so what I do to kind of calm that down is I gently pat him on top of the nose and I just say, good boy, good boy. And what happens is the mouth closes and it just settles into the grip. Then I take the thing away and I always give some food afterwards, right? Because I just want to keep motivation high, even though this training is a bit stressful. We built that up over about actually, it was only about 4 sessions, I think. So 4 days, 1 session a day. I got to a point where I got him to hold the object without my hands touching him for 5 seconds. Now something interesting happens because now I grab I'm using like a wooden dowel, like just a round wooden object. That's what I'm teaching him to hold with. But now I hold that in my hand and we're just going for a walk and I'm just holding it by my side. Guess what happens? He comes up, he jumps up, wagging his tail, and he puts his teeth on it. Boom. Now that indicates to me we're ready to start going the other way around. We're ready to start with positive reinforcement at this point. So the last session that I had with him was today, this morning. And basically, I started doing what I did with Agna to begin with. I hold the dowel out. He puts teeth on it. I reward. I said click before. I don't actually use a clicker with him because I'm only using verbal commands, but let's ignore that for now. So now I get him to hold it for a second. I get him to hold it for a second and a half. We get to 2 seconds. He tries to spit it out. I touch the bottom of his jaw and he immediately clamps down again. We got to 5 seconds of just positive reinforcement training in 1 session. That's all because we started teaching it with pressure and he learned, okay, this is something that I need to learn how to do. If I offer the trainer, the person in front of me to maybe help them out and do it voluntarily, guess what? Maybe the pressure goes away entirely. And that's exactly what happened. So even when a dog is really hesitant to do something, we can help them through that with a little bit of pressure. Now, I need to add a caveat there. If your dog has like doesn't want to sit or doesn't want to drop or something, don't push them too hard on that until you've had a health check. Because I have seen multiple dogs that maybe they've got hip issues, right? Maybe they've got a sore elbow, something like that. And that's actually what creates the resilience for them to lie down to sit. So make sure that they get a health check before you start putting a little bit of pressure on them. But with Rex and with his hold conditioning, his mouth is fine. He's got no ulcers. He's got no pain. He chews fine. He chews on bone just fine. So to him, it wasn't a physical barrier. It was, for some reason, a mental barrier or maybe even a genetic one, right? He just had this opposition to holding things in his mouth. That's when I guided him through with a little bit of pressure. And guess what? That opened us up to go back into positive reinforcement training. But yeah, I just want to say if your dog doesn't want to lie down, just make sure they're healthy physically and that it doesn't hurt them in some way, form, or shape, because that can be a big problem. Um, all right. So that's the unforced force fetch, hold conditioning, basically how I teach dog how to do something with the use of pressure. Now, I want to finish up on an interesting case that I had a while back. Um, I had a dog. It was like a Staffy cross. This is a few years ago, so I can't remember exactly, but he was some kind of Staffordshire Terrier cross. And the dog was quite young when I met him. I think he was probably just about a year old. And he had massive issues with the crate. Just the crate. He didn't have separation anxiety. He just had some weird confinement thing going on in his head. Now, I don't know that much about what training had been done to the dog before, but what I do know is that they had worked with a force-free trainer that told them to feed him in the crate, throw treats in there on a regular during the day just to encourage him to want to be in there. And that's all fine. That's, how I teach dogs how to be comfortable in their crate. But for this dog, it just didn't take. And what happened was he actually started getting super aggressive when they tried to close the door. He would throw himself at the door. He would even bite the owners in order for that door not to be shut. Now, again, I have seen this previously in extreme separation anxiety cases where the dog goes like, if that door closes, I'm in trouble because they're going to leave. And they've learned to be aggressive to make sure that that door stays open. But it wasn't the case with this dog. The second they left the house, he rolled up on the couch and he slept till they came back. Never destroyed anything, never anything like that. So for some reason, he had learned that I don't want that door to close. I don't want to be confined. Now, the owners were quite soft as well, so he was bullying them quite a bit. They had no authority with him. He was pushing them around. He would bite them when they tried to put the leash on. Like there were other issues going on, but the crate thing was a massive problem for them because they had grandchildren that would come around, and he would get too rowdy with the kids and jump on them and bite them and all that kind of stuff. So they wanted to lock him away, while they were going through the training of teaching him to chill around the kids. Perfectly fine to do. But yeah, he had gotten quite aggressive, and it got to the point where he would go into the crate, and no matter what you dropped in there, you could drop a bone in there, you could drop some food in there, put his food ball in there, he would jump in and he would turn around and he would start growling towards the door immediately. And again, just to reiterate this, the dog wasn't resource guarding. He'd never had an issue with his food ball or a bone outside of the crate. Didn't care at all. It was the door closing that was the issue. So how do we fix this? Well, believe it or not, I crate trained that dog entirely with an electric collar. Oh no. Now people are going to start crying again. Oh my God, but the crate's meant to be a safe space, not meant to be punishment, blah, blah, blah. Now we have to cry a little bit more. all right, settle down, you fuckwits. I'll talk you through this. So, so what I did with this dog is we put an electric collar on him. We didn't do any conditioning because I didn't want to spend a long time teaching him how the e-collar worked because I just wanted him to learn that the crate was in fact his safe space. So now we find a low level. I think we used level 12 from memory on this dog, and that's 12 out of 100. So it's barely a tenth of the potential output on the of the electric collar. And we threw some food in the crate. He jumped in. We didn't try to close the door or anything. We just left it open. He ate the food. He stepped out of the crate. Now, guess what happened the second he stepped out? The e-collar turned on. Now, at this point, he was freaking out a bit. He was kind of spinning in circles. He was bouncing around a little bit. And I got the owner to throw another handful of food into the crate. He noticed that he ran into the crate. The second all four paws were back on his bed in the crate, guess what happened? The electric collar turned off. We didn't close the door. He came out. The electric collar turned on. We threw another handful of food in. Boom! He blasted back into the crate and he ate the food. 4 repetitions, and guess what happened? He didn't try to get out of the crate. He just sat down and looked at us. So we threw another handful of food in and we shut the door. Now, the second we began shutting the door, he took a step forwards and started growling. The e-collar activated one more time. He immediately stopped and sat down. 24 hours later, I get a video from the owners. I didn't leave an electric collar with him. I didn't do any of that. We just did this in one training session. I got, I think it was 24 or 48 hours later, I got a video from the owners of him just on his back, sleeping soundly in the crate. And they said, no fighting. We didn't have to shove the door in his face. He wasn't howling. He wasn't screaming after we shut the door. He didn't growl at us, nothing. He just walked in, he got his treats, we locked the door, and he fell asleep. So what happened in that instance? Well, basically, we taught him that when we ask him to go into the crate, yes, that's going to be a pleasant thing because food's going to follow. But also, if you try to break out of the crate, you're not going to be safe from the electric stim. So the dog steps out, the electric stim turns on, he walks back in, the electric stim turns off. Now, we know from a lot of, there's been quite a few studies with mice on this particular thing, that, when a floor gets electrified, the rats, it's rats usually, not mice, but they try to find a way to turn that electric stimulation off. Right. Now, this has sometimes been trained with a lever beforehand. So they press a lever, food comes out, then they stop giving food. And now when the electricity comes on, they press the lever and the electricity goes away. So same principle, positive, negative reinforcement. But when you're only working to get something all the time, no clear boundaries are set. Right? When you stimulate a dog on an electric collar outside of the crate and you throw some food in and you turn the e-collar off when the dog's in the crate, guess what? They learn that being in the crate's fucking fantastic. Now, I'm going to stress this. Do not do this by yourself if you don't know how to use an electric collar. If you're not familiar with using an electric collar, you need a good professional balance trainer to come help you out with this kind of stuff. Because if you just start blasting the dog while he's in the crate, that is the worst thing you can do. Right? This requires finesse, it requires good timing, and it requires a good understanding of behavior. But yeah, that's how I crate trained an aggressive dog to being comfortable in his crate. Sometimes you have to keep this in mind. Positive reinforcement always falls apart on its own eventually. Like with some dogs, you can get very far, Some dogs you can't get far at all. Every dog's an individual. You got to work the dog in front of you. And I know we keep saying that, and everyone says they do it, and most people don't, because they just go, hey, I've got a process. But that's the first, and no, not the only. I've done this with 2 dogs. I have crate trained hundreds of dogs. Twice have I used the electric collar. So this isn't something, this is my go-to. This is my like, oh shit, we've got a problem. We need to fix this quickly. But again, if you find that you're having a dog that is somehow resistant to learning behavior, that is fighting back on some grounds of not having had clear authority, hasn't learned properly to listen and to follow instructions, negative reinforcement can be the thing that pushes you over that boundary, that creates the understanding in the dog that this is important. And believe it or not, this actually builds a better bond between the person and the dog. Why? Because we're putting ourselves in a position where we say, hey, I'm not going to let you bully me. I'm not going to be unfair to you. I'm not going to be an arsehole and just blast you, right? That's not what it's about. It's about teaching with low-level discomfort, the same way that most children train their parents to look at them. How do they do that? Well, they tap them on the shoulder. They go, mum, 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 until you look at them. Then they stop saying mum and the tapping stops. Guess what? Your child just trained you to listen to them with negative reinforcement. There. Oh, my brain's cooked now. And hopefully this has been helpful. Hopefully it's given you some things to think about. Something like, hopefully it's giving you something to think about outside of like, how can I throw treats at this problem? Like if you have a big problem that you need to resolve quickly, pressure and negative reinforcement is very often going to be your way to get there. Just keep that in mind. Don't get hung up in this, oh, we have to be as gentle as possible and we have to always be kind. We always have to train with positive reinforcement first. That's not always the case. Sometimes the dog needs to learn, hey, this is happening whether you want to or not. It is in your best interest. I know you have no idea at this point that it is in your best interest, but that's why I'm training you, or that's why I'm teaching you with pressure at this point. God damn, I messed up training and teaching a lot today. But cool. I think that's all from me. Really hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you have taken something away from it. I hope maybe you can think about the use of pressure in a little bit of a different way now. Not as something to stop the dog or hammer the dog with, but something to like prod the dog on the shoulder to go like, hey, I need you to do this and it's going to be in your interest to do it. Again, my brain's still a bit cooked. My voice is going. I'm getting snottier, so I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much for tuning in. And yeah, keep tuning in. We've got I'm in the process of lining up some cool interviews all around the world at the moment. So this is there's lots of good stuff coming. It's just a lot going on. And I just need to get over this fucking cold as quickly as possible. Anyways, thank you so much for tuning in. And now go train your dog. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Beastly Talks. I hope you found it interesting and that you'll join me for the next one as well. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate and review it so that more people can hear about it. Or if you think this particular episode would benefit a family member, friend or colleague, be sure to share it with them directly. You can follow me on social media at Viking Dog Trainer on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube. Thank you for your support and keep training your dog.